So welcome to my first video ever, starting a new semester here with Bio 461. I wanted to go over membrane potentials. Hopefully this will help you guys, especially when it comes to Nernst potentials and the membrane. Those can be a little bit confusing. So first you need to understand electrochemical gradients. And this can be determined well if you look at two different cells with a semi-permeable membrane. In this case, let's say it's permeable to potassium. If there's a higher concentration gradient in one of these two cells, then the potassium is going to want to flow to where the lower gradient is. And that's pretty easy to understand, but when we start throwing in other things such as chloride and add that negative charge into cell B, that negative charge is going to have a pull on the positive charge of the potassium electrically, keeping it within cell B. So these two forces, the electrical and chemical gradients, are going to be what determine ultimately the balance and the equilibrium that will be across any membrane when we eventually reach a net movement of zero for a given molecule, such as potassium. So easy enough is the concentration gradient to understand. If you have a higher concentration gradient on one side, it will always go towards the lower. The little bit more difficult to understand, however, is the electrical gradient. Now, some mad scientists came up with something called the Nernst potential. This is going to be ultimately what helps us determine when the electrical gradient will cause equilibrium with the concentration gradient. Under the correct conditions, this is really good at helping us determine the equilibrium potential of any cell or membrane. But it has one problem. Ultimately, the Nernst equation assumes something that can't ever be correct, which is that the membrane is 100% permeable to the given ion being studied. So this is not true. For any molecule, we will expect that there are other forces that are acting on it besides the electrical and chemical gradients, and so this value is never going to equal exactly what we would expect for any molecule, and especially some are really off. The Nernst equation, though, is a force and helps us determine the force that electrically is going to prevent a molecule from either following its concentration gradient or other driving force. If you think about this like a hill, and if you were to kick a ball down a hill, there's going to be a certain force needed in order to keep that ball from rolling all the way down. If the hill in this case is a concentration gradient, assume then that the ball is potassium. It's rolling down the hill due to a concentration gradient or other driving force behind it. The Nernst potential is going to describe the electrical force necessary to keep that potassium from going down its concentration gradient. Once this is accomplished, then it will reach an equilibrium. And that pretty much describes the Nernst equation and the Nernst potential. In the next video, we'll go over driving force. But here's the final summary of this. In a cell, it's going to work very similarly to that original AB setup that we talked about, with both chemical and electrical gradients that are necessary to establish an equilibrium. But when we talk about the resting membrane potential of a cell, it's going to be different than the Nernst equation, because the Nernst potential and equation assume that the molecule is 100% permeable, which we know is never true. The resting membrane potential, however, takes into account all aspects of a molecule and thus is more accurate. We'll see you guys next time.